This is episode 33. In episode 32, we had concluded chapter 5. So we are now done with chapters 1 to 5. Chapter 1 was Arjun Vishad Yoga. Chapter 2 was Sankhya Yoga. Chapter 3 was Karma Yoga. Chapter 4 was Jnana Yoga. And chapter 5 was Sanyas Yoga. Today, we will start chapter 6. The core learnings of the Gita can be found in chapters 1 to 4, out of which chapter 2 is the real core, and 2 together with 3 and 4 have the most profound insights. Chapter 6 also has explanations or elaborations and contains a few additional important learnings. There are 47 verses in chapter 6, and I have observed that it is called by many different names. Some people call it Adhyatma Yoga, others call it Dhyana Yoga, Atma Sanyam Yoga, etc. For practical purposes, this chapter is more commonly known as Dhyana Yoga or Yoga of Meditation. So let's address it accordingly. Today we will cover verses 6.1 to 6.9. Let me start with the literal translations and then we will talk about some interesting things. Starting with verse 1. Shri Bhagwan Uvach Anashritah Karm Phalam Karyam Karm Karotiya Sa Sanyasi Cha Yogi Cha Na Niragni Na Cha Akriya. God says those who perform karma or righteous action without desiring the fruits of their actions are actual sannyasis or renunciates and yogis. See them also not niragni and not without action. Na niragni means not without fire or renouncing your unbridled desires, the concept of being a doer, and the impact of sensory objects such as sorrow, happiness, gain, and loss. One who is beyond this is an actual sannyasi or yogi. So God is saying that those who perform karma without desiring the fruits of their actions are sannyasis or yogis. Also, those who have renounced their unbridled desires and are not without action are renunciates. This is verse 1. Verse 2 is Yam sannyasam iti prahu yogam tam vidhi pandava nahi asanyast sankalpo yogi bhavati kaschana. God says, what is known as sannyas can be considered as yoga or pandav. One who has not renounced their unbridled desires or attachments cannot ever become a yogi. Sankalp here refers to unbridled desires. So one who has not renounced the unbridled desires can never become a yogi. Also consider sannyas as yoga. Here yoga and sannyas are being interpreted similarly, and we have been reiterating the same throughout the course of our conversations. Yoga is action done with perseverance, principles, and rational discrimination, and where you renounce your senses as well as the concept of being a doer. So this is verse 2. Let me read verses 3 and 4 together. Aruruksho munir yogam karma karanam uchyate yoga rudhasya tasyaiv shamah karanam uchyate yada hi nah indriyartheshu na karmasu anushajyate sarva sankalpa sannyasi yoga rudha tad uchyate. God says, one who is in an early stage on his path of yoga, for him duty or karma is the means to yoga. And for the one who is already elevated in yoga, tranquility is the means. In one way, God is saying that you perform actions or duties when you are a beginner, and that's your path to yoga. But when you reach the level of excellence, the means change to akarma or actionlessness. In chapter 4, when we talked about karma, akarma and vikarma, then we said that reaching a level of excellence in action eventually makes you reach a stage of actionlessness. When you are a beginner, karma is your path. And when you are elevated in yoga, then actionlessness becomes your means. Further, God says that one who is neither attached to sense objects nor the fruits of actions, such a person is said to be elevated in the path of yoga, having renounced all attachments for the fruits of actions. These are verses 3 and 4. Let me now read verses 5 and 6 together. Uddharet atmana atmanam na atmanam avsadayet atma ev hi atmanah bandhu atma ev ripuh atmanah bandhu atma atmanah tasya yen atma ev atmana jatah anatmanah tu shatrutve varte ta atma ev shatruvat. God says, elevate, raise or uplift yourself through self and never degrade yourself, for self is the biggest friend as well as the enemy of the self. Remember, God is interchangeably using self for soul and ego. Self here refers to both Krishna and Bhishma. Atma interpretation is for both ego and soul. The self's interpretation is for the soul as well as the ego. God is saying, elevate the self through the soul. The soul is a friend of the self and ego is its enemy. Further, God says that soul is the friend of the one who has conquered self through soul. That is the one who has conquered ego through soul. And one who has failed to control self, for him, self is an enemy. In other words, ego is the biggest enemy for you. So these are the interpretations of verses 5 and 6. Again, the usage of words like self and Atma in the Gita is mainly for soul and ego. That is Krishna and Bhishma. Verse 7 is Jitatmana Prashantasya Paramatma Samahita Sheet Oshan Sukh Dukheshu Tatha Man Apamanayo. God says, the one who has conquered their ego and one who is always focused on the eternal remains peaceful and calm during the dualities of cold and heat, joy and sorrow, and honor and dishonor. This is verse 7. Then verse 8 is Jnana Vijnana Triptatma Kutasthu Vijitendriya Yukt iti Uchyate Yogi Sam Loshtam Ashma Kanchana. God says a yogi is the one whose soul is satisfied by the knowledge and rational discrimination, has conquered their senses, is immovable in summit consciousness, and remains undisturbed in all circumstances. A yogi sees everything, a lump of earth, stone, and gold, as the same. So the one whose soul is satisfied by knowledge and wisdom, one who is immovable, unchangeable, and has conquered their senses, one who is yukt and sees everything as the same, be it a lump of earth, stone, or gold, is known as yogi. This is verse 8. Then verse 9 is Suhrit Mitra Ari Udasina Madhyast Dveshya Bandhushu Sadhushu Apicha Papeshu Sambuddhi Vishishyate. God says the yogis look upon all well-wishers, friends, foes, the pious and the sinners with an impartial intellect. And the one who does that is distinguished among humans and has obtained excellence. So this is verse 9. These were the literal translations, and in all the 9 verses, God talks about looking at everything as equal, talks about being in a state of constant bliss, and about controlling ego by soul. One who can do that considers self as a friend, and for one who doesn't, the self is an enemy. Again, God is describing the state of eternal peace and how one can attain that state in all these verses. Again, it's important to quote a few verses such as 6.1 where God says, Shri Bhagwan Ovach, Anashrita Karma Phalam Karyam Karma Karotiya Sa Sanyasi Cha Yogi Cha Na Niragne Na Cha Akriya. God says, those who perform karma without desiring the fruits of their actions are actual sannyasis and yogis. He uses the word na niragne in this verse. It doesn't mean that one who doesn't perform agni is not a sannyasi. Agni in this context means to renounce. Fire is a symbol of renouncing, where you renounce your unbridled desires, senses, and concept of doer. So na niragni in this context means to renounce, and that is important to repeat from verse 6.1. In verse 6.2, God says, Yam sanyasam iti prahu yogam tam vidhi pandava nahi asanyast sankalpo yogi bhavati kashchan. God says what is known as sannyas can be considered as yoga, O Pandav. One who has not renounced their unbridled desires or attachments cannot ever become a yogi. The word sankalp in this verse is important as it does not mean determination. Instead, it means desire. Kalp is referred to as desire in this context. Kalptaru is the tree of desire. So kalp reflects desire here and sankalp reflects with desire. So that is important to know. Don't misinterpret sankalp as determination, since we need perseverance. We have constantly been talking about the need to do karma with perseverance in chapters 2 and 3. So it is not about perseverance, persistence or determination. This is about desire when we refer to sankalp. Then verse 6.3 is also important where God says, Aruruksho muneh yogam karma karanam uchyate yoga rudhasya tasaiv shama karanam uchyate. God says one who is a beginner or ascendant on the path of yoga, for him duty or karma is the means for yoga. And for the one who is already elevated in yoga, tranquility is the means. So a beginner has to act. And as you become excellent, then actionlessness is achieved. that is also important to understand. These were verses 6.1 to 6.9, and I hope you liked it. We will stop here. Thank you.